Thanks very much, Peter. I really like that term, dignitarian humanist. In fact, I think I'm just going to steal it from you because I think that it probably fits with quite a lot of the ideas that I would like to put forward as well. Well, it's all very difficult following Peter because Peter, of course, is always portrayed as being the pro-life speaker, which kind of sets me up as being the harbinger of death, I suppose, and destruction. And I always find it quite difficult because I think that actually probably when it comes down to some of these moral discussions and discussions about the nature of morality, the nature about human life, the nature about life in the womb and so on, probably Peter and I will agree on more than we would disagree with. And I think that probably in the case of the argument that you've just put forward, I think that there's a lot that I will follow on, and I'm grateful to you for putting those points because it means that I can refer to them and not have to explain them in detail myself. To start off with, can I just say, from the point of view of the rules of formal debating, I considered quite carefully how much time we should really sort of spend on this discussion of really how to define moral status. And I'm really going to kind of put that slightly to one side because I don't entirely accept the definition that Peter's put forward on it. I think that there are lots of ways in which you can look at the discussion of moral status, and in fact it's quite a problematized area, and there have been whole tomes that have been written on various different ways of looking at moral status, and I don't really think that's the substance of what we really want to look at tonight. I think that what we really want to look at tonight is when we talk about the embryo, when we talk about the pregnancy, the unborn child, how we look at it and what kind of a moral status we want to accord to it. So forgive me for not really taking up on that point. I do think it's important that we consider what we mean when we talk about the unborn child. And I am far less precious about the language that surrounds this discussion, as indeed perhaps many of my colleagues in the pro-choice movement are. You can call it the unborn child, you can call it the fetus, you can call it the embryo, you can call it products of conception, you can call it the pregnancy. What we're clearly talking about here is the entity that in the kind of natural state, if you want, we're talking about residing or existing within the woman's uterus when she's pregnant. And I think that's what we're really talking about. We're talking about the moral status of that particular entity, the embryo, the fetus, the unborn child, that entity that I would agree perhaps with Peter, we would say is of her, but is not part of her. You can't say that the fetus, the embryo, is just part of a woman in the way that you would say that her finger or her appendix or her uterus itself is part of her. We're talking about something that's alive. It's clearly alive in that it's not dead. It has a beating heart. We can see a beating heart on the monitor and so on when we scan it. It's not like a cancer or a growth. I think that probably a lot of people who would regard themselves as being pro-choice on abortion have shot themselves in the foot very clearly by denying what we are really talking about when we're talking about the reality of what the fetus or embryo is. I don't think it is like a cancer or a growth. I think we are talking about an entity that is particularly unique. It has a unique DNA that's not just a mutant DNA. It's not just something that has mutated in any particular way. It's something that is drawn from its parents, using the word loosely. It is a combination of the sperm and the egg, the sperm of the putative father, the ovum of the putative mother. I don't have any question, any problem about recognising its uniqueness. And I'm actually completely on Mary Warnock's side and probably on Peter's side when you sort of say that if you look back And if you trace us back, when did we become something that was unique? Well, I do think that that's a point of uniqueness. I was rather entertained by Fiona Bruce's comments when she was putting forward her 10-minute rule bill, when she basically made the point that all of us, the one thing that was common to all of us in these Houses of Parliament is that we once all were embryos. Great brain, Fiona Bruce. That is indeed the case. You were all embryos. It's not, however, the case that all embryos become MPs. And when we're looking and we're assessing at the state of Fiona Bruce, we're probably more inclined to think about her status in the here and now. But the point about it is that, yes, there is a uniqueness, and yes, it does go back, and there is something that I think that if you want to draw a particular point where you say that something significant happens, which is not just a development of something that's going on, I'm perfectly prepared to say that let's say that it is with conception that happens, and at that point you have an entity that has the potential to be one of us, uno de noi. One of us, that at that point you have something that has the potential to be a baby, to be a child. So let's not dispute that. I would say that there is something there. Some of you may dispute it. Now, there's been a quite lively discussion on Facebook about this already, but I'm prepared to give it that point. I think Peter's wrong to say that the law has always fudged the issue, because I don't think that the law does. The law has actually given the embryo a special status. That's where Mary Warnock's discussion came up, right from her report in 1984, and it was something that was reflected in the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act in 1990, that the embryo does have a kind of status. And I have to say that where I kind of fall on this, in terms of the moral status of the embryo, and I'm going to use that as being slightly distinct from the unborn, for a reason that I'll come on to in a minute. I think the moral status of the embryo, there's a lot of sense in the approach that Warnock takes to it, where she made the point in her report that we could concede the embryo a special moral status, by which what I will mean is that we have a certain obligation to it. We're seeing it in a particular way, a special moral obligation to it. But she makes the point that the embryo, we can give the embryo a special status, but not the same status as a living child or adult. Right, so she makes the point that you can give it a particular moral status, but not make it equivalent to a living child or adult. She said at that point, and I think I would agree with this, that the embryo, that there's something about it that makes it entitled to respect beyond that that's given to embryos of other species. So she, as some of you will say, and those of you who are into animal rights will have a particular problem with this, because you'll say that it's a particularly speciesist position. And I throw my hands up, I am undeniably a speciesist, in that I think that there is something that is uncommonly special about human beings, for exactly the reasons that Peter has said, our capacity for rationality, our capacity to know, that I'll come on to in a moment, gives us something that makes us distinct from other beings. And I think that the embryo, I would say, has a status that is above that. But Warnock made the point, and this is where I think that I would probably differ from Peter in this, is that the respect that we accord to the embryo, the moral status that we accord it, is not absolute and may be weighed up against other particular benefits. It's not absolute. It's not. It's not the same as children or adults. It's above that that's given to other species, but we can weigh it up against other things. And when Mary Warnock, the philosopher, was making that point, she was doing it when she was considering, for example, embryo research. And what she was saying at that point is that here you have these embryos who have something that is very special about them. Perhaps they have the potential to develop into one of us. But when you look at them in that form and at that particular time, they are not of such great significance that you cannot sacrifice them for the greater good of humanity. And I would fall with that, because what I would say is that whereas all of us can potentially look back, as Peter said, and track back at what point we became that unique individual, you can say that it is with the embryo perhaps that we started. It doesn't necessarily mean that the embryo is one of us, in the sense that what that embryo is then has exactly the same qualities that we have now in those children and adults and people who we generally talk about with this vague concept of personhood, which I think many of us really try and pin down in a way, because when we really say what's different about humans, what makes us different, what our humanity is, we try and attach it to this sense of personhood, which is quite a slippery one. And it's quite, I hold it myself, but I agree that it's quite a difficult thing to pin down. But where I would try and pin it down really is a little bit like this. I think, it comes down to when we talk about humans, about there being a species differentiation, what demarcates us from animals. I think it's more than our DNA. There is something about us that makes us different. It's kind of always funny arguing with religious people, because I guess in the past you guys would have tended to call it the soul or something, and you would have looked at some divine intervention that would have come into it. Now we don't tend to do that so much, but we do look at there being something that is very, very specific. Something that means that we venerate our humanness, some quality that we have. And I think it's perfectly proper and appropriate to look back at that quality that we have that makes us venerate our humanness and ask, well, when does this begin to manifest itself? When does it really begin to happen? Sometimes use the example of being on a country drive with a very small boy in the car and driving past a field of sheep, and him asking me the question as we drove past this field of sheep, Mum, oh, I've given it away, do sheep know? And I kind of, know what? He said, no, Mum, do sheep know? And in some ways, that's a very fundamental question to this. It's a very fundamental question when you think about it, because that is actually what is fundamental, I think, to this notion of humanness and personhood, which is our capacity to know. Because to know, when you think about what knowing really is, knowing has intrinsically implies a sense of itself, a sense of having, a sense of being alive, a sense of having, of existing, a notion of having an existence. And coming with that notion of existence comes a sense of where you are in time, where you are in place, what can happen to you, and also what you can do for yourself. And if Peter lets me, I'll return to this point at some point later on in the discussion, but I'd just like you to hold that thought for the moment, that what we're talking about here, I think, when we talk about humanity, when we talk about humanness, when we talk about personhood, we talk about a being with a capacity to know that it exists in and of itself. I think that's what differentiates us from animals, along with a sense of causality, along with a sense that we can do things and care that we do things. And I think that that's really what differentiates us. And I think that there's a very big question when we talk about the embryo and we talk about the fetus, about whether we can apply to them that particular construct. Now, we can say that they potentially have the capacity to do that, but whether or not they do that at that particular time, whether they have a sense of themselves, a sense of being alive and of what life is, I really think it's very difficult to stretch the point and to make a claim that indeed they can do that. I think that there's a lot about the way that we view it, that means that it is a complete extension of the imagination to imagine that the fetus in the womb has any sense whatsoever of what life as a human really is. And so to my point, you know, we can have debates about sleeping people, we can have debates about people in coma, we can have debates again about people who have severe mental incapacities, and we can look at what their perceptions are of things in the round. But the one thing that we can certainly say about the fetus and the embryo is that it has not yet reached the stage where it can even begin to contemplate those things. And that's why in some ways I find it very difficult with some of Peter's colleagues who apply a kind of anthropomorphism to the fetus that I think a lot of animal lovers really apply to animals, which is where they look at characteristics of things that are going on in the womb and they try and kind of create a sense of, oh, that must mean. So people talk about, well, oh, the fetus can, you know, look at it smiling when it hears its mother's voice. Well, how on earth is the fetus going to have a concept of motherhood and voice and all of these particular things? Oh, look, it's sucking its thumb for comfort. How would it know what comfort is? All of these things that in some ways you simply cannot apply to something that has not yet had any existence outside of the womb. But the point is that when it comes to the unborn child, as opposed to the embryo. And this is where I think things get very interesting for us, and Peter really didn't address it at all. There's a vital additional factor, and that is that when we talk about the unborn child, the embryo or the fetus is whatever status we want to give it, and however subjectively we look at it, there is no denying the fact that it is completely interred, it is completely residing within the uterus of a being that does have a very clear moral status, and that is the woman that is carrying it, and that the embryo, the fetus, is entirely dependent on her. And it raises very severe questions where we're basically saying that the life of that embryo or that fetus must be preserved above all cost. What that means for her moral status, because the question really is to what extent does her moral status become less important than the moral status that we accord to the embryo, because the moral status of the unborn, I would argue, can no more stand alone than the embryo can exist alone without the woman. And so I would say that while the status of the fetus may be debatable and contested, the status of the woman is not. She is certainly conscious, she is certainly sentient, she's certainly self-aware, she certainly has a rational capacity, she has a biography, she has a life, she has a sense of herself, and she has a sense of the future. And I would argue that to take away her ability to make moral choices, in fact, is to reduce the moral status that we give to her, because it's effectively to reduce her and the status of her humanity to just a beating heart and DNA, just as I think we do not want to do with the embryo. So what I'd like to do is to leave that point there hanging in the air and perhaps to move back to this point of the status, the moral status of the woman later on in the discussion. But I think that's the point that Peter's introduction has omitted. We can talk about the moral status of the embryo, but we cannot do that without talking about the moral status of the woman. Thank you.